Of all the European countries visited by rail fans in the days of steam, few exerted such a strong appeal as Spain, with its huge variety of locomotives and perfect holiday weather. In the pre-charter flight age, holidaymakers arrived by rail, steam-hauled, and often in delightfully antique wooden coaches with open-ended balconies. The tourists looked extremely well dressed by today's standards. Starting in the mid-1960s, steam operation began to be steadily phased out. The line in the north along the Ebro River on the Bilbao to Barcelona route was one of the last served by Spain's classic passenger classes. Biggest of the breed were these imposing green-liveried confederations, of which just 10 were built by Maquinista in Barcelona in 1956. Castejon was the main stop on the surviving steam-operated section from Miranda to Zaragoza. Arriving in Castejon here is one of the 482s of the former Madrid, Zaragoza and Alicante Railway, the MZA. Dating from 1939, this was another small class with only 10 built, in this case due to economic problems. World War II started less than a year after the end of civil war in Spain, stifling any chances of economic recovery. The semi-streamlined style of these engines reflected the fashion at the time of their construction. Getting ready to leave on a local passenger is one of the 141F class mixed traffic Mikados, RENFE's most numerous and successful class. Although all Spanish locos, bar the Confederations, were painted black, the 141Fs from Soraya Depot sported green smoke deflectors. But they were mostly used on freight, and their performance proved equal and often superior to that of the older and heavier 8-couple classes. When Spanish steam ended in 1975, many locomotives were sent to museums, but very few have been kept in working order. In the northwest of the country, the lines around León, Santiago and Vigo form the regular stamping ground for one of them, a beautifully restored 141F, normally based at León. On a rainy day at the marine terminal in Vigo, the engine was on a special for the annual convention of the Amigos del Ferrocarril, the Spanish Railfan Society. The Society's León chapter spent 2 years restoring Mikado number 2346, which had been on display at León Station. Their work was faultless, bringing the loco to as-new condition. 432 of these engines were built. They were designed by the North British Locomotive Company in Glasgow, who supplied the first 25 of them in 1953. Where a Spanish locomotive number features an F in the middle, it is not a class designation, it stands for fuel, indicating the locomotive is oil-fired. Threading its way through Vigo docks, the train uses track that is hardly used these days, but has fortunately survived the recent redevelopment of the waterfront. The Leon team running the engine are mostly professional railwaymen volunteering their free time. The driver, however, has to be a RENFE man on official duty, although he seems to display a certain nervous lack of familiarity with the art of steam driving. Leaving the main line at Redondela, the train passes high over the rooftops as it takes the branch line to Santiago. The station of Villa Garcia was celebrating its centenary when the special paused briefly to pay its respects. The passenger service on the line has been entirely modernised with new rail cars, making the presence of locomotive-hauled carriages a distinct rarity, quite apart from the steam. Arriving at Santiago for the Rail Fans Convention, the train passes under the imposing covered station roof, recently reglazed and strengthened at its southwest end against the prevailing Atlantic weather. The next morning there was time for a look at the old city of Santiago de Compostela, famous for its shrine of St. James. In the Middle Ages, it was a refuge for Christians escaping the Moorish occupation of central and southern Spain. It became a place of pilgrimage second only in importance to Jerusalem and Rome, and even today it still attracts thousands of pilgrims every year. While their passengers toured the town, our locomotive team prepared for the next stage of the steam trip to RENFE and Leon. Team leader is retired senior driver Durruti Santos, a respected figure in Leon, who was involved in the restoration of the Mikado and hasn't missed a single trip since it resumed service in 1996. A loose nut doesn't escape his sharp eye for long. Durruti and the team carefully checked the gradient profile of the line before setting off. Durruti normally takes the fireman's place during the Mikado's trips, where he can both supervise the crew and check the controls himself. The direct main line from Santiago to Zamora and Madrid was opened as recently as 1957, one of many development projects in Spain delayed for up to 3 decades, first by civil war in the 30s and then by shortages caused by World War II. The direct high-speed service from Madrid to Santiago salutes the waiting Mikado as it races through the wayside station of Erisho. The 5-coach rate of 1960-built carriages is dedicated solely to the Leon steam operation and is maintained by the same team. La Encina was an important station on the Alicante main line of the old MZA and formed the junction for Valencia and the coastal route north to Barcelona. Most trains, both passenger and freight, change locomotives here. This passenger train has arrived from Alicante and the through carriages from Valencia are being picked up. By 1967, most of the passenger trains in the area had been taken over by the modern 141Fs. Arriving at La Encina is a Valencia to Madrid service. But some passenger work still remained for the 141F's predecessors, the 240s. Around La Encina yard, several 141Fs were shunting, showing the wide variety of work performed by these engines. Also at the shed was one of the last of the big mountain-type locos, of which 57 were built by Maquinista between 1944 and 1952 for the Madrid to Alicante line. By 1967, only a few remained here on their original route, the rest being either sent north or put into store. Still giving good service were these MZA 480s built back in the 1920s. Post-war 240 here on a long, heavy freight consisting entirely of short wheelbase four-wheel wagons, most of them made of wood, a period piece indeed. An afternoon spent at La Paria at the foot of the climb to La Encina enabled John Aldred and Peter Handford to capture this classic sequence of a typical afternoon at a Spanish country station. Rushing through on a fast freight is another XMZA 480. The assistant station master fills in the time between trains with other duties not strictly connected with the railway service. In this remote corner of the Spanish hinterland, it pays to keep a fresh food supply on the premises. pointsman sets the loop for the next freight which is stopping here. Another XMZA 480 heads the train and is duly flagged in by the station master. This loco dates from 1927, and one can see that it was originally coal-fired by the evident later addition of the letter F in the centre of the number plate when the loco was converted to burn oil. Goods trains unable to rush the bank need plenty of sand and grit to get a grip on the rail when starting off. A textbook send-off by Senor Mateo Gonzalez, the station master, and the freight gets underway again. But for many, the stars of the line were the Beyer-Garratt articulated locomotive. Introduced by the Central of Aragon Railway in 1930, these British-designed machines, double 282s, were used to avoid double heading. Spain was the only country in mainland Europe to adopt this design, the patent of Beyer Peacock in Manchester, and initially just 6 of them were built under license by Babcock and Wilcox in Bilbao. Their last stamping ground was in the northeast, on the steep line from Tarragona on the Mediterranean coast through Villavert to Lerida. Just a few miles from the coast, life in the 60s was still very primitive. The Mikado Garratts survived on seasonal traffic as late as 1972, and fortunately one of them was stored at Lerida. The example preserved, number 0421, is still at Lerida and has been put back in working order, sponsored by the City Council for local excursions and special events. The original design of 1930 had been so successful that as late as 1960 it was decided to build 10 new ones to augment the original half dozen. Number 0421 was the first of the new batch, which followed the original blueprints with no significant alterations. Although 30 years out of date, they were excellent performers and were well liked by the loco men. Being built right at the end of the steam era, in fact the last steam engines to be built by RENFE, these Garratts were unfortunately taken out of service with years of life still left in them. The last ones ran in 1972. All the members of the restoration team play their part in running the excursions, among them the rolling stock manager, Senor Ramos Carlos. American practice is followed in placing the loco number on the headlamp, but 282 here doesn't mean it's a 416-4, it's just the nearest the continental notation gets to describing a Garratt. Some of the items fitted to the loco seem to be at variance with the original Beyer-Peacock design. The main attraction at Lleida is not only the preserved Garratt, but also the line it runs on. The expensively engineered branch to Pobla de Segur in the Pyrenees was originally planned in 1904 to be part of a trans-Pyrenean route to France. But the scheme was abandoned in 1951 after just 90 kilometres had been built. It's hard to imagine this sleepy branch ever being part of a main line. The station here at RENFE has been reduced to an unstaffed halt, but it is specially opened when the Garratt runs to let it cross the afternoon railcar from Pobla to Lleida. The large number of waiting passengers this summer Saturday belies the true situation. Normally there's only a handful of passengers and the line runs to heavy loss. RENFE would like to close it, but a provincial subsidy keeps it going. The downgrading of the line status can be seen at Pobla de Segur, where the station now has no tracks at all. These have been cut back to make room for a car park, but there was no money for a new station, so the old one has to do. The layout of the track at the terminus is so basic now that the support coach for the Garratt has to be hand shunted to switch it to the other end of the train for the return run. After a leisurely lunch break for all concerned, the Garratt picks its way through the weeds before setting off on the return trip to Lerida. The hilltop village of Talan provides a typical Spanish setting for this now rather overgrown branch. The restoration of the water column at the wayside station of Celes Limiana was sponsored by the Society. President of the ARMF, the society in charge of the Garratt, is Senor Oscar Urgeles, who normally accompanies the loco on all its trips. We were invited aboard the locomotive for a ride through the gorge section, which, despite its speed limit of 40 km per hour, was nonetheless a dramatic experience. The cab roof opening was firmly slammed shut as a precaution against rockfall. The cab's wine pitcher, containing water of course, was in much demand as the heat of the day's work continued. The sight of a Paris to Madrid express in the magnificent gorge of the Noguera Pallaressa will remain a pipe dream forever, but the imposing presence of the Garratt does at least do the line occasional justice. Mountain section safely behind, the cab roof is opened again for some welcome ventilation. The train stops at Balaga to offload its passengers proceeding onward by road. This is normally the only manned station on the line, where the train is cleared for the final run across the plain, still at 40 kilometers an hour, back to Lleida. We now go back in time once more to the Valencia-Madrid main line, to revisit the La Encina area in the last days of Spanish steam in the 60s. Still to be found here was that greatest of rarities, unique in Europe, the express passenger Garratt. These double Pacifics were ordered for the Central of Aragon Railway in 1930, and, like the Mikados, only 6 of them were built. In 1967, when these shots were taken, they had just been removed from the Rapido Express along the Mediterranean coast of Tarragona and sent inland to work heavy freight in the hills. Passenger trains are now hauled by 141Fs. Even though the Pacific Garratts were demoted to freight, they were most impressive machines, the more so in this unique pairing with an MZA 240, both locomotives designed in the 20s. It seemed strange that heavy passenger trains were being double-headed when locomotives designed specifically to avoid this were sharing the same tracks on humble freight work. In these happy days, the inspection car was the only vehicle on the line powered by the internal combustion engine. The Spanish Pacific Garratts went out in style, ending a 40-year reign of unique and distinguished service.